All right, so to begin with, we're going to start with the distance between 2 points. For the purpose of this example, let me just draw 2 points here. Let me stop this share. Let's see. Actually, I'm looking for. Okay, so let me just draw 2 points. Random points. Let me call this my first point, and let me call this other one my second point. Right, random points. Now, the coordinates of one of them, of my first point, let me call it x1, y1. Right, we saw that notation back in algebra when we learned slopes, x1, y1. In reality, what that means is x of the first point and y of the first point, right? So I'm calling that my first point. And then I'm going to call this other one, let's call the coordinates x2, y2. Right, there's a comma in between. And again, what that means is the x of my second point, my y of my second point, that's all it means. And then I'm going to ask you guys, find the distance between my points. What that means is if I was to make a segment, if I was to connect my 2 points, what's the length of the segment? Now, if it was just horizontal or vertical, that would be pretty simple. That would be pretty simple because I could count the squares. But on this one, we don't have that. However, there's a thing I'm going to be doing. Let me draw this point. It's at the same height, so on the same wide level as the first point, but it has the same x value of the second point. The coordinates of this point are x2, y1. Right, x2, y1. x2 because it has the same x as my second point, and y1 because it has the same y as my first point. Now, we're not going to be talking about midpoints. I have a question here, midpoints. No, we're talking about the distance. We're talking about the distance between the 2 lines. Now here, funny thing is that I can create a right triangle. When I look at one of my sides, I'm looking at this one specifically, I can find the length of that side, right? It's vertical. I can count the squares. In this case, I can literally count the squares. Or if I didn't know, I could just do y2 minus y1. I noticed that on this side, the x values are the same. So the distance is not going to matter. The only thing is going to matter is the difference of the y's. So y2 minus y1. That is this side. This other side at the bottom, again, I can count the squares, but I can also say, I noticed that this side is made by the points where the y value is the same thing. So I'm going to say this side is going to be x2 minus x1. Okay, so I have a question on the chat. Let me finish the formula. You'll see exactly what we use. I have here, it says, so is that the equation that we use to find the other side? I'm still working the question. So let's wait, okay? So I know one side, I can find the length of it by going y2 minus y1. The bottom side, I can do it by x2 minus x1. Notice at the bottom side, I don't subtract the y values because it's the same thing. So y1 minus y1 is 0. The only difference are the x values. All right, we talk about the Pythagorean theorem, right? That's something that you guys know as a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. Right, that's Pythagorean theorem, and that works when we have a right triangle. I notice I have a and b. If you relate it to my triangle, I have a and b. The interesting part is that if I do the square root on both sides, I get a squared plus b squared is equal to c. My hypotenuse is basically the square root of a squared plus b squared. Okay, so what does that mean in our case? I'm going to do the hypotenuse here. This is the square root. But my a squared and my b squared, let me write that as x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. This, if you notice, that's my a, and this, if you notice, that's my b. So I had a squared plus b squared. I know my a is x2 minus x1, and I know my b is y2 minus y1. It's got a little complicated. However, this is what we're going to be using for our work. So this is how the formula gets derived. Let me come back to our notes. So here where it says find the distance between each pair of points. So I have 2 points and I'm going to find the distance. I just derived the formula. So I'm just going to use the formula that I just showed you guys a few minutes ago. I'm just going to use that formula. So let me, on my notes, I will just write the formula. It's going to be the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Right? That's the formula. I just showed you guys a few minutes ago how the formula gets derived. This is the formula that I'm going to be using. So how does that look on our examples? I'm going to do a big square root. And inside the first parentheses, I'm going to do x2 minus x1, which means the second x minus the first x. So I'm going to do 3 minus a negative 6 all squared. In between my parentheses, I'm going to do a plus, and then I'm going to do negative 1 minus 8, and then inside parentheses. Remember the notation, the x2, x1, what's y2, what's y1? What it means is my first point, I'm going to call it x1, y1. That means the x of the first point, the y of the first point. My second point, let me call it x2, y2, which means the x of the second point and the y of the second point. So now my first parenthesis, 3 minus a negative 6. That's basically 9. 9 squared. My second parenthesis, negative 1 minus 8. That's basically a negative 9 squared. And all of this is inside the square root. Then I have 81 plus 81, all of it inside a square root. So I have the square root of 162. Simplify the radical if possible. What I'm going to do, I'm like, all right, I think I can divide it. I remember my perfect squares. 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, and more. Make sure you guys remember your perfect squares. And then I'm like, 162. How do I simplify this? I'm going to split this into 2 square roots. I'm going to be thinking 2 numbers that multiplied equals 162, but one of them has to be a list from my perfect square. Then I get on the chat here, I have questions is, how about 9 times 18? All right, let's try that. 9 times 18 is equal to 162, so 9 times 18. Now, if you're wondering, how did we get those numbers, then try it out. On your calculator, go 162 divided by 4. And doesn't work. It gives me a decimal. How about 162 divided by 9? Now that works. Now this breaks down to 3 radical 18. So 3 square root of 18. The 3, because the square root of 9 is a perfect square. But then I think we can do better. Square root of 18, we can do better. How about I split 18 times 2 as 2 radicals, and I'm going to break that as 9 times 2. The square root of 9 is 3. Now I have 2 whole numbers. So let me multiply those out. And my answer will be 9 square root of 2. All right, not too bad. Let me take a look at number 34. The first point, let me call this x1, y1. Again, x of the first point, y of the first point. My second point, let me call this x2, y2. X of the second point, y of the second point. Here I have a question, a thing on the chat. It says, this is confusing with all the simplifying. Yeah, at the beginning, I'm going to say it's a little confusing. Just keep trying, guys. Keep trying. All right. So I see my first parentheses. I'm going to do the second x minus the first x. All right, Thomas, I see you raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, do we just for the homework, we just input the same answer as yesterday for the square root. So we do like 9 square root and then parentheses 2.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so number 34. By first parentheses, I'm going to do the second x minus the first x. So let me go 3 minus 5 squared. That's the first parentheses. And let me put a plus. My second parentheses, let me do the second y minus the first y. So 1 minus a negative 7, all squared. And all of this is inside the square root. The radical, the square root, is the last thing I deal with. All right, my first parentheses, 3 minus 5. I know that's a negative 2. And it's all square. My second parentheses, 1 minus a negative 7. We know that's 8, and which is squared. And again, all of this is inside a square root. My first parentheses, negative 2 squared, that's 4. 8 squared, that's 64. And all of this is inside a square root. I know 4 times 64 is 68. And again, that's a square root. And then I start thinking, can I possibly divide this? Can I simplify this? I'm thinking 68 divided by 4. Well, that gives me 17, I mean. So yeah, that means I can break this as a 2 square roots, 4 times 17. The square root of 4 becomes a whole number. So my answer is 2 square root of 17. This is a reminder how we type this. 2 square root of 17. Right, the same way we typed things yesterday. All right, let's take a look at a couple more examples. Kind of confusing at the beginning, yes, but it will get better. The formula we have it on top. Use that formula. What I'm going to be doing, again, this is x1, y1, right? That's my first point. So the x value and the y value of the first point. And this other one, let me call it x2, y2. So my first parentheses, I'm going to do the second x minus the first x. So 3 minus a negative 5. My parentheses is going to be squared. There's going to be a plus sign in between my parentheses. So the second parentheses, I'm going to do the second y minus the first y. So negative 4 minus 6. And that parentheses, it is squared. And all of this is inside a square root. My first parentheses, 3 minus a negative 5, that gives me 8. 8 squared. My second parentheses, negative 4 minus 6, that gives me a negative 10. I'll keep it inside parentheses, so we keep it at the negative sign. All of this is inside a square root. I know 8 squared is 64. Negative 10 squared, that's 100. All of this, again, is inside a square root. So I know that gives me the square root of 164. Then I ask myself, can I simplify? Yeah, I can break this into 2 square roots. And I'm thinking, all right, one of them has to be from the perfect squares. And I ask myself, how about 4? 164 divided by 4 is 41. All right, so I guess that's my other number. 4 times 41 is 164. I know the square root of 164 becomes 2 square root of 41. Then I ask myself, square root of 41, can I do better? No. All right, so that's it. I'm going to say 2 square root of 41. Question here is, how did you get that 8? Okay, so just looking at the first parentheses, 3 minus a negative 5. We know that two negative signs make a plus sign. So 3 plus 5 is 8. That's how I got the 8 from the first parentheses. All right, let's take a look at number 36. I'm going to call this x1, y1. Again, that's from my first point. And then x2, y2. That's from my second point. The x and the y value of my second point. My first parentheses, the second x minus the first x, right? x2 minus x1. So I have 0 minus 8. And that parentheses is going to be square. My second parentheses, the second y minus the first y. So 2 minus a negative 1. And this parentheses is going to be square. I'm going to have a plus in between my parentheses. Have a plus in between my parentheses, and all of this is inside a square root. All right, my first parentheses, 0 minus 8. That's a negative 8. I'm going to keep it inside parentheses because of the negative sign. There's the plus. The second parentheses, 2 minus a negative 1. Remember, the two negative signs make a positive sign. So 2 minus a negative 1, that's 3. Square. And I know this is inside a square root. I know negative 8 squared, it's positive 64. 3 squared is 9. And this is inside a square root. So 64 plus 9, I know it's 73. So this is the square root of 73. And then I think, can I possibly simplify? I think of my perfect squares. Remember, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. I tried. None of them is, 73 is not divisible by either of them. So that's it. I cannot simplify. My answer is square root of 73. So SQRT 73. Do me a favor, don't capitalize the first S. I know I said before, when we write words, but technically this is part of a number. Square root is part of a number. So don't simplify the S. So that's how we do distance. This is going to be the hard part of today. Make sure, let me emphasize, use your formula. Make sure you guys use that. I derived the formula using Pythagorean Theorem, right? I showed you guys a little bit earlier ago. Now, we're going to move on now to circles. Here it says, identify the center and the radius of each. Right? A circle has a center and a radius. And then we're going to sketch the graph. The interesting part is for my centered, I'm going to put a C for centered. For the centered, I'm going to use my values that I have inside my parentheses. Here I have a question. Could an answer be just a square root? Yeah, that was number 36 from our notes. Didn't you see that? Yeah, it's possible. Okay. Let's pay attention to our lecture. Now looking at question number 37. The center, the X and the Y value of my centered, I'm going to use the values inside the parentheses. I'm going to use my 4 and my 3. I'm going to use the values. The only thing is I'm going to switch the sign. So the center of my circle here, the coordinates are going to be -4, -3. Again, I'm using the values in X and Y. But only thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch the sign. I saw pluses, so I changed it to negatives. If there was a minus, I will change it to positive. Like I said, we're using those values to switch the sign. So I know where the center of the circle is. Now the radius, I'm gonna use this last number. The only thing is that this is radius squared. So I'm gonna get the square root of that. For my radius, I'm gonna do the square root of 4. I'm gonna do the square root of the number by itself. I see everything is square, so that is radius squared. I know the square root of 4 is 2. So I find that the radius is 2. I know the center. All right, so let me graph this. For my center, I can easily plot a point, -4, -3. All right, we know how to graph points, -4, -3. The radius is 2. So what I'm going to be doing now, from the center, I know the radius is the distance from the center to the edge of the circle. So from the center, let me go 2 spaces each direction, right? The radius is 2. So from the center, let me go 2 up. From the center, let me go 2 down. From the center, let me go 2 to the right. And from the center, let me go 2 to the left. Right, the radius was 2. So I went 2 each direction from the center. Now those 4 points are going to give me a very good idea how the circle is going to look like. Freestyling is kind of hard to draw circles, so that's the best that I can do. That's it. That's my circle. You guys can see the center. You guys can see the circle. I'm going to talk about in a little how you guys going to turn in for your homework. On paper, it is easy to graph, but now online, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. For right now, let's just focus on how to graph a circle. So I identified the center and radius. I found the center, I found the radius, and then I graphed it. Looking at question number 38. For the center, remember I used the X and the Y values. I just switched the sign. So the coordinates of the center are +1, -4. Notice again that I switched the sign. For the radius, I use the last number, the number by itself, but I'm going to do the square root of such number. So I'm going to do the square root of 1. Right? The square root of 1 is 1. So the radius is 1. Let me graph the center of the circle, right? Let me plot the point 1, -4. It's right there. That's the center of the circle. Because the radius is 1, from the center, I'm going to go 1 each direction. So 1 up, 1 down, 1 to the right, 1 to the left. From the center, I went 1 each direction. Those 4 points give me a very good idea where the circle goes through. So I'm just going to draw a circle. I'm hoping you guys are like, this is not too hard. Okay, let's take a look. Question number 39. The center of the circle is going to be -4, +2. Notice I switched the signs. The radius is going to be the square root of the number at the very end. So the square root of 1, and I know the square root of 1 is 1. So let me plot my center first. -4, 2. That's right there. The radius is 1. So from the center, I'm going to go 1 each direction. So 1 up, 1 down, 1 to the right, and 1 to the left. All right, so I can just draw my circle going through those points. Again, this gives me a very good idea. Freestyling, I know I draw eggs. Freestyling, it's hard to draw circles, but that gives me a very good idea. Now, let's take a look at our last circle, last graph. Then I'll talk about how are you guys going to type it in. My center of this circle is going to be 3, -3. Again, I switched the signs. My radius is going to be the square root of 7. Okay, now I don't have a perfect square, but I do have a calculator. There's square root of 7, right? I'm going to type it in. It gives me about 2.6. Okay, so the way I'm going to graph this, I'm going to plot my center, 3, -3. There's the center of my circle. The radius is 2.6. The way I'm going to see this in the graph is 2 and a little bit more. So from the center, let me go up about 2.6. It's about there. Let me go down 2.6. So it is okay to go more than a whole number. We can use decimals. It's not a big deal. Let me go to the right about 2.6. And let me go to the left about 2.6. Now, if this was on paper and you guys had to graph it, I'm not going to grab a ruler and be like, oh, you went 2.4 and not 2.6. No, in reality, if this is on paper, the way I will grade it will be the radius is 2 and a little bit more. Then I'm just going to grab my circle. Again, I do draw eggs, but that's how we do it. Now, for your homework, this is going to be multiple choice. You guys will be given choices where the graph of the circle is there, but then you also see information about the center and information about the radius. So again, drawing it on homework online, not too simple. So for that reason, I'm going to give it to you multiple choice. Now, our last topic, 41 through 44. 41 through 44. Now, this one you will have to write it down. This one you will have to type it in your homework. Use the information provided to write the equation of each circle. So I have the center, the radius, and I'm going to write the equation of the circle. When I mean equation of the circle, I mean something like this. Notice on those cases, we had the equation of the circle. From there, we got the information and drew the circle. Now we're going backwards. Given the center and the radius, we have to write the equation of the circle. We use the fancy word equation just because there's an equal sign somewhere in there. So I'm just going to draw. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do, my parentheses. Let me just write it first, and then I'll talk about it, how to type it in. My parentheses, I'm going to do x minus 17 over 2 squared. I'm going to have another parentheses, y plus 19 over 2 squared. Notice I switched the signs on the x and the y. In between my parentheses, there will always be a plus. If you put a minus, you're going to get what we call hyperbola. It doesn't look like a circle. It will look something like this. That's what the minus does. So you have to put a plus because you have to connect them. So there's a plus in between them. And then here, I'm going to write equal to 17. All right, how did I get the 17? I squared the radius, right? Square root of 17 all squared is 17. When you square that square root, you just get the number on the inside. Now, how are we going to type this? I'm going to open my parentheses. I know I'm using fractions, but fractions is just a division. I'm going to use x minus 17 over 2, close my parentheses, to the second power. Right? For exponents, we use the caret, the thing that comes in the 6. Then I'm going to put my plus in between my parentheses. So that plus has to be there. My second parentheses, notice I'm going to open the parentheses, and I'm going to go y plus 19 backslash 2, right? 19 over 2. Close parentheses. And all this is to the second power. And then equals 17. So in red, you see how we write it. In blue, you see how we type it. All right, let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at number 42. The way we write this, my first parentheses is going to be x plus 15 over 2 all square. Notice I switched the sign. I have a question. Are there any spaces? No, it's all together. Thanks for asking that. All together. My second parentheses is going to be y plus 12. Again, notice I switched the sign. And I'm going to square that parentheses. In between my parentheses, there's a plus. And this is going to equal to 4. Radius squared. The radius is 2, so 2 squared. That's how we write it. The way we type it. Open parentheses, x plus 15 backslash 2, close your parentheses, to the second power, plus my second parentheses, y plus 12, close parentheses, to the second power, and this is equal to 4. Again, in red is how we write it. In blue is how we type it. All right, let's take a look at question number 43. Let me deal how we write it. To begin with, I can write this as x minus 0 squared. Notice I switched the sign. Now the radius is always squared. I have a question here. Is the radius always multiplied by 2? Not by 2, squared. Notice what I did on number 41. Okay, here, so I have x minus 0 squared. My second parentheses is y minus 11 squared. Notice again, I'm switching the signs. There's a plus sign right in between them, and this is going to equal to 34. Radius squared, right? The square root of 34 square. Now, there's a thing too. One more thing. Every time we deal with a minus 0, we can simplify things out. So I'm still going to say how we write it. I'm not going to go to typing yet. This will be written, if we were writing this as x squared plus y minus 11 squared, it's equal to 34. That's how I will write it. Right? Notice that minus 0, we just don't use minus 0. We just write it as an x. We're simplifying it. So some cases in your homework, you might write into a letter by itself. In this case, x squared. That means that the value, because x is by itself, the x value is 0. If by any chance in your homework, you run into the y by itself, just a y squared, then you know the y value is 0. Okay. Now, how am I going to type this? Is a little bit easier. X to the second power. Notice I'm not using parentheses on the x. I'm not doing x minus 0. So I have x squared plus, open parentheses, y minus 11, close parentheses, to the second power, equals 34. Lastly, let's take a look at number 44. The way I will write this, I will write x plus 2 all squared. My second parenthesis will be y minus 16 all squared. Again, notice I switched the signs. There's a plus sign in between, and this is equal to 1. Radius squared, right? Radius multiplied by itself. The way I'm going to type this will be, open parentheses, x plus 2, close parentheses, to the second power, plus, open parentheses, y minus 16 to the second power, and this is equal to 1. Couple things. Don't forget to close your parentheses on each of them. Don't forget that each parentheses goes to the second power. And another thing, don't forget the plus sign in between your parentheses. Let me zoom out so you guys can take a screenshot of our work from today. I'm assuming the hardest part is the beginning, but remember, I have intervention, so come back to intervention. Let me stop the recording first.